The street outside was damp, not with a proper downpour, but with that thin, persistent drizzle that seemed to fall sideways and cling to the back of your neck. No matter which way you turned your collar, Margaret sat in the corner of the café, Damis, nursing a cloudy glass of white wine that had grown warm. He wasn't here for a case, not officially. He'd come to see an old friend, or perhaps an acquaintance was more accurate. A retired railway clerk named Jules Simenon, who had written to him 3 weeks ago with a cryptic line, "I believe something is going wrong across the street. It keeps me up at night. I'd like to speak to you, if it's not too much." That was all. No detail. No urgency. But Margaret had written back and said he would stop by the next time he was in the area. He hadn't announced himself to the man yet. Instead, he was watching the house across the narrow street. It was the sort of building you saw 1,000 times across Paris, for stories slightly listing on one side, chipped paint on the shutters, and the smell of boiled cabbage escaping through the open window on the second floor. It looked like nothing, and yet Margaret, over the years, had learned to listen when people like Simenon said something was off. Retired clerks, widows, bakers, they lived in these streets and noticed things far more quickly than the police ever could. He lit his pipe slowly, tamping down the tobacco with his thumb. Though the barman had already given him a look when he came in, there was no rule against smoking, but a growing preference against it. Still, no one said anything to Margaret, not because of his reputation. Most of these people wouldn't have known him, but because of his manner. He filled space quietly, but with certainty. You knew he wasn't to be disturbed, though you couldn't say why. Simenon hadn't shown yet. The clock behind the bar struck 7 with a metallic ping. Margaret looked outside again. A young woman with a green umbrella walked past the building, then paused, frowned, and turned back to glance at the street lamp standing just across from the entrance. It was flickering erratically, a sickly pulse, weak yellow behind the fog, almost like a warning light on a dying machine. Margaret frowned slightly. The woman stood under it for a few seconds, then shook her head and walked off toward the metro. Her hesitation didn't mean much, but something about it clung in Margaret's mind. The way she had looked up, just once, at the second-floor window. Not fear, not suspicion, just unease. The cafe's door creaked, and Jules Simenon shuffled in, wearing a brown raincoat that had lost its shape. His face was lined and uneven, the result of long hours of clerical work and perhaps longer ones of regret. He spotted Margaret, smiled faintly, and walked over. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said as he sat, without waiting for invitation. "I said I would," Margaret replied simply. "I know. It's just, well, people promise all sorts of things." Simenon ordered coffee, even though it was evening. His hands trembled a little when he placed them on the table. "I know what it sounds like," he said after a moment, "like the sad ramblings of a bored old man. I live alone. I don't sleep much, and across from me, nothing dramatic ever happens. But still, something's wrong. I feel it." Margaret waited. He didn't prompt. "There's a girl in the building. 3rd floor. Quiet, plain. Works in some kind of office. I see her leave around 8 every morning. She comes back around 7. Always alone, always the same routine. But last Thursday, I saw her come back crying, not weeping, just walking as usual, but tears on her cheeks. He paused, fiddling with his spoon, and then the man on the second floor. Monsieur Renan, strange fellow, teaches at a lycée, very polite, but he watches. You know the type? Stands by the window with the curtain just barely parted. Maigret nodded. 3 nights ago, I saw him standing outside under that street lamp, just standing there for almost 20 minutes. In the fog, no smoke, no phone, just standing. What time? Just before midnight. Did you see the girl? No. Maigret puffed his pipe once, then asked softly, "And what's kept you up at night?" Peakmore swallowed. "Last night, I heard a sound, like furniture scraping, a heavy thud, and then silence. I opened my window. The street was empty. But this morning, the girl didn't leave for work." Maigret said nothing. He tapped his pipe against the ashtray. Across the street, the flickering street lamp buzzed faintly. A light went on in the second-floor apartment. A man's silhouette passed behind the curtain. The movement was casual, but somehow calculated. Maigret stood. "Come," he said. "Let's take a walk." And with that, the mystery began. Not with a scream or a body, but with a man standing too still in the fog, a girl who did not cry often, and a street lamp that refused to shine quite right. The drizzle had thickened into a slow, fine mist as Maigret and Peakmore stepped out of the cafe and crossed the narrow street. The street lamp buzzed overhead with its uneven flicker, throwing weak halos of light onto the pavement. It gave the building an uncertain, wavering presence, as if it could dissolve back into the fog at any moment. Maigret paused outside the entrance. A worn wooden door scratched at the base where a dog had once waited, the brass handle dulled by years of use. Peakmore lingered beside him, but didn't follow inside. "I haven't spoken to anyone in there. I just watch." His voice carried no guilt, only the resigned tone of a man who observed more than he wished. Maigret nodded faintly, then pushed the door open and stepped into the dim hallway. The air inside was thick with the smell of cooking oil and damp wool. A cluster of letterboxes lined the wall, some with missing nameplates, others with names scratched into the brass. M. Renan, M.M.E. Vauquelin, D. Blunkett. No sign of the girl's name. Though that wasn't surprising. Young women living alone often preferred anonymity. The staircase creaked underfoot as Maigret ascended. Each step released a faint groan from the wood, a sound that seemed louder than it was in the stillness of the building. On the second floor, landing, he paused outside Renan's door. A faint scent of pipe tobacco hung in the corridor. Not Maigret's variety, a dry, bitter blend. He knocked once, then waited. No answer. He knocked again, and this time a movement stirred within, cautious and deliberate, like someone slipping quietly into their slippers before approaching. The door opened a fraction. Yes, the voice was smooth, practiced, a man used to projecting. Politeness like a shield. "Inspector Maigret, may I have a word?" A moment passed. The door opened fully. Renan stood in a brown cardigan and grey trousers, his face pale and thin, with eyes that blinked deliberately. Behind him, the apartment was clean and spare. To clean, perhaps. Books lined one. Wall and tidy, rigid rows. A metronome ticked softly atop a cabinet. Renan didn't move aside to invite him in. "Is there something wrong, Inspector?" Maigret tilted his head slightly. "Just a routine visit. There was a report of unusual noise in the building last night. You may have heard something." Renan shook his head slowly, but his eyes narrowed. No, I don't think so. I sleep lightly. I would have noticed. Do you know your neighbors well?" Renan hesitated. "Not intimately. I've spoken to Madame Vauquelin upstairs once or twice. And there's a young woman on the third floor. Quiet. I've seen her on the stairs, but we've never spoken." Maigret gave a small nod. "Have you seen her today?" Renan looked past him, toward the stairs. "No, come to think of it, I haven't. But that's hardly unusual. I imagine she keeps to herself." Maigret let the silence linger longer than was comfortable. Renan adjusted the sleeve of his cardigan. "Well," Maigret said at last, "if you do recall anything, even something that seemed trivial, you'll let me know, of course." The door began to close before the words had finished. On the third floor, the hallway was darker. A single bulb overhead flickered uncertainly, casting a sickly yellow light that gave the peeling wallpaper a jaundiced hue. Maigret knocked on the girl's door. Nothing. He knocked again. Still silence. He bent slightly and pressed his ear to the wood. No sound inside, not even the usual hum of a fridge or the tick of a clock. He glanced around, then tried the handle. Locked. He descended to the ground floor and stepped outside. Peekmore was still there, his collar turned up against the mist. "Her name's Denise Blunkett," he said softly, without prompting. "She works at a tax office near the canal. I saw her once getting off the bus near the butcher's. Alone. Always alone." Maigret lit his pipe again and stood under the street lamp. It was flickering more steadily now, a slow, erratic rhythm like a heartbeat trying to decide whether to stop. He looked up at the windows. The second floor, Renan's, was dark again. The third floor remained lifeless. "She has a sister, I think," Peekmore added. "Visited once or twice." Loud voice. "They argued. That was 2 months ago." Maigret exhaled slowly through his nose. "What did they argue about?" Peekmore gave a helpless shrug. "Money, maybe, or a man. I couldn't hear much. But something. About a promise. The sister slammed the door when she left." Maigret didn't take notes. He rarely did. He remembered what mattered, and what didn't matter never seemed to survive more than a day in his memory. He nodded to Peekmore and walked to the corner phone booth. At the station. A sleepy sergeant answered. "Send a locksmith to Rue des Deux-Ports. 3rd floor." Quietly. "Do we have a report?" "Not yet." He hung up and waited under the flickering lamp, his hands in his coat pockets, feeling the cold settle through the damp wall. Across the street, the rain began to fall harder, thin streaks running down the grimy glass of the 3rd floor window. No movement inside. No silhouette. No life. He wasn't certain anything had happened. And yet, something about that window, the stillness of it, the way the lamp outside insisted on drawing attention to the door beneath it, like a faulty spotlight casting suspicion on a silent stage. The locksmith arrived 20 minutes later, a young man with red ears and a leather satchel of tools. Margaret led him up the creaking stairs without explanation. The door gave way after 2 minutes of gentle work. It opened onto a narrow apartment, kitchenette, sitting area, a door leading to a bedroom. Everything was tidy. Nothing looked wrong. And then Margaret stepped inside, not with urgency, but with the careful tread of a man expecting to be disappointed. In the bedroom, the curtain was half drawn. The bed was made. A shoe lay on its side near the radiator. Just one. Margaret bent and picked it up, damp, the sole slightly scuffed, as though someone had taken a step, then stopped, then turned around. There was no body. Not yet. But something was missing, and not just the girl. The room had that faint, undisturbed stillness Margaret had come to recognize over the years. A quiet so complete that it wasn't merely the absence of noise, but the absence of presence. Denise Blankett's apartment was clean, but not meticulously so. A coat hung on a hook by the door, limp and wet at the edges. There were dishes in the drying rack, a single plate, a glass, a butter knife, nothing excessive. The sort of home you return to each day out of habit rather than joy. Margaret moved through it with slow care, letting his gaze linger not on what was there, but what was not. A single towel drying in the bathroom, 2 pairs of shoes in the corner, a jar of instant coffee with barely a spoonful left, next to a cup whose lip bore a faint pink smudge, lipstick, possibly. But the mirror above the sink held no cosmetics, and there was no handbag in sight. The closet door was ajar. Inside, neatly arranged clothes hung with uniform spacing, blouses, skirts, a few sensible jackets. The shoes told a similar story. Practical, rarely worn hard. He ran his finger along the top shelf. No dust. This was not a neglected space. Whoever Denise was, she took quiet care of her world. It didn't feel like someone planning to leave. He checked the small calendar pinned beside the kitchenette, a few days marked with tiny pencil notes. Dentist, 5 p.m. Visit Lucy? None in the past 2 days. A woman like Denise would have noted a weekend trip, a planned leave. Anything involving an absence longer than a single night. The young locksmith hovered near the doorway, eyes darting nervously. Should I wait, monsieur? No need. Go home. Margaret replied, barely glancing over. Thank you. Once the man had left, Margaret sat for a moment in the straight-backed wooden chair by the table. He lit his pipe, not out of indulgence, but to think. The smoke drifted lazily toward the ceiling, curling into the pale yellow light above. No signs of forced entry. No note. No mess. Just a room holding its breath. He rose and walked down to the 2nd floor again. This time, Renan did not answer. Immediately, the light was still on inside. Margaret knocked with more weight after a moment. The door opened just a crack again. Yes, Inspector. I'll need to speak with you now. Inside, there was no invitation, but Maigret stepped forward and the man yielded. The apartment was exactly as before. Only now a jazz record played low from an old radio, filling the corners with a lazy melancholy that didn't quite fit the tension in the air. Renan perched on the arm of a chair, hands folded too tightly in his lap. "Tell me about Denise Blanket," Maigret said. Renan looked up, startled. "I told you. We've never spoken. And yet you noticed her, didn't you?" He hesitated, only in passing. She's hard to miss. She moves quietly, rarely smiles. You can feel people like that more than hear them. They make the air around them heavy." Maigret nodded once, slowly. "When did you last see her?" Renan blinked. No, 3 days ago. She was walking up the stairs ahead of me. Didn't speak. Didn't look back. I went into my flat. I assumed she did the same. And last night, around midnight, I was asleep. Maigret said nothing. He simply watched. Renan's hands twitched. "What's this about, Inspector? She's not home." Her door was locked. No sign of her leaving, but her shoe's still there. And she's not the kind to vanish. Renan shifted uncomfortably. "If something happened to her, it's got nothing to do with me." Maigret studied him for another moment, then stood. "Don't go anywhere. Someone will be by to speak with you again." Back outside, the rain had stopped, but left the street slick and glistening like black glass. He walked slowly, pipe clenched in his teeth, until he reached the small apartment of Madame Vauquelin. On the top floor, she answered in slippers and a robe, her hair wrapped in a net, smelling faintly of lavender and soup. "Sorry to disturb you," Maigret said, "but I'd like to ask about your downstairs neighbor, Denise Blanket." "Oh, the quiet one," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "Of course. Is something wrong?" "She hasn't been seen in 2 days." Madame Vauquelin's face tightened. "She always leaves at the same time. Always. You could set your clock by her. But yesterday, the bus came and went and she didn't appear. I thought maybe she was ill." "You didn't check?" "I'm not the sort to meddle, Inspector. But yes, I did knock yesterday morning." "No answer." Maigret nodded. "And the man below you, Renan?" A pause. Strange one, that. Very polite, but always watching. He used to teach somewhere, I think. Never leaves his flat unless it's late. Always in the window, like a cat. Maigret thanked her and stepped back into the hall. As he descended, he passed Denise's door again. It stood open still. The air inside now seemed slightly cooler, as if her absence had deepened in the last hour. He closed it gently and turned the key from the inside. The lock clicked into place like a quiet warning. Back on the street, Pickmel had vanished. A small shape waited near the lamp. A girl in a beige coat, her back to him. He approached. She turned. It was someone new, younger, heavier set, perhaps in her 20s. She flinched as he neared. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I'm looking for my sister, Denise." She nodded. "I'm Lucy. We had an argument weeks ago, but she didn't come to our lunch on Sunday. She always comes. She's not home." Maigret said gently, Lucy's face fell. Did she leave? A note? A message? Nothing. When did you last speak with her? Lucy pulled her coat tighter. 3 weeks ago. I came here. We argued. She thought I was judging her. Her job. Her boyfriend. Boyfriend. Lucy blinked. You didn't know. Maigret said nothing. His name's Claude. Claude Renan. From the 2nd floor. He's older. Very precise. I didn't like the way he talked to her. He made her feel small. Maigret looked up at the window. The lamp buzzed overhead. The light inside Renan's flat was off. Did she say she was ending it? Lucy hesitated. She said she was thinking about it, but she wasn't afraid, just tired. Maigret thanked her. She lingered by the steps as he turned away. At the corner. He stopped. Rain began again, faint and slow. He stood beneath the awning of a closed bakery, the sweet scent of old bread lingering in the wood. Now it began to take shape. Not a murder, perhaps not yet, but a vanishing tide to pride, silence, and the faint scent of control. And above them all, the flickering lamp kept watch, cold and impartial. The following morning arrived without promise. The sky remained a uniform sheet of pale grey, and the rain, having thinned to a cold drizzle overnight, still misted the rooftops and narrow ledges of Rue des Deux Ports. Maigret stood at his office window in Quai des Orfèvres, gazing down at the sluggish Seine and sipping from a chipped white cup. The case hadn't yet been registered as a formal disappearance. There was no corpse, no confession, no blood, just an empty room and a presence that had quietly evaporated. He didn't call in reinforcements. Not yet. He hated the flurry of uniforms. That disrupted a neighborhood's rhythm before anything had even been established. Instead, he sent a brief note to Inspector Lucas asking for the personnel file of one Claude Renan, age, previous postings, academic history, and then he returned, quietly, to Rue des Deux Ports, as though he was simply running an errand on foot. The building stood unchanged in the morning light, sullen and tired, its paint flaking at the corners of the shutters. The fog had lifted slightly, allowing shapes and sounds to return to the street. But the street lamp still flickered sporadically, like a cough it couldn't shake. Maigret stood beneath it again, watching. There were no sudden movements, no sharp entries or exits, just life, slow and unaware. Inside, Madame Vauquelin was watering her plants. She opened her door a crack as he passed, said nothing, then quietly closed it again. He knocked at Renan's apartment door this time. The man answered fully dressed, in a dark sweater and slacks. His hair was combed neatly. Maigret observed these details without comment. I won't take much of your time, Maigret said calmly. I'd like to look around your flat. Just a formality. Renan's eyes flickered. Do you have a warrant? No. Then I'd prefer you didn't. Maigret nodded once, as though he had expected it. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object, Denise Blancet's shoe. He had wrapped it in a clean handkerchief. He held it up gently. She didn't leave with both. People rarely do. Renan's jaw clenched. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. Maigret didn't press. Instead, he lowered the shoe and tucked it away again. You said you never spoke to her, he continued, but her sister says otherwise. I never lied. I said we never had a real conversation. Just the odd greeting on the stairs. Maigret said nothing. He let the silence expand in the room. In these moments, words weren't his tools. Pressure was. And pressure came in silence. In the creaking radiator. In the tick of a wall clock that sounded louder with each passing second. Renan crossed his arms. This is absurd. If you're suggesting I had something to do with her disappearance, I'm not suggesting anything. Maigret cut in softly. I'm listening. Renan's voice lifted slightly, brittle. I'm not your suspect, Inspector. No, Maigret. Agreed, you're not. Not yet. He turned and left without another word, downstairs. The concierge was polishing the glass of the front door with a rag. That had long ceased to be effective. She was a small woman, shaped like a wine barrel, with grey curls piled tightly under. Annette, did you see Denise leave at all in the past 2 days? Maigret asked. She pursed her lips. Not since Thursday. She usually nods when she pauses. Never rude, never late on her rent, either. And Renan, she gave a shrug. That one keeps to himself. But he's been going out more lately, after dark. For years, he never budged. Going where? Couldn't say. Always alone. Maigret tipped his hat and stepped out again. Walking slowly up the street, there was a bakery on the corner. Not the closed one from the night before, but a different one, already bustling. He ducked inside and bought a croissant and a small cup of coffee, then returned to the same street lamp dot he stood, eating slowly, looking up once more at the third-floor window. Still no movement, still no lights dot from across the street. He saw Peekmel approaching again, hands stuffed into the pockets of a coat that looked too large for him now. She hasn't come back. The old man said flatly. No, they stood in silence for a while. The city passed around them, oblivious. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed. A car honked, followed by a shouted curse. Life moved, but that window did not. There's something else, Peekmel said finally. I didn't want to say it before. Maigret waited. 3 weeks ago, I saw them together, Denise and Renan, late evening, near the canal. They weren't arguing, but she looked small, folded in on herself. And him, he looked satisfied, not smiling, but like someone who'd won something. You're sure it was him? Yes. He touched her arm. Not tenderly, like she belonged to him. Maigret nodded faintly, then walked on without explanation. The station that afternoon, Lucas brought in the file. Claude Renan, 48. Former literature teacher. Resigned 5 years ago. No criminal record. No complaints on record. But 2 students dropped out mid-term without explanation. One was a young woman. Maigret studied the notes in silence. He lives alone. No family. No visitors. Nothing else. Where did he teach? Lucas checked. A private lycée in the 14th arrondissement. Closed now. Merged with another. Maigret closed the file. Thanks. He returned to Rue des Deux Ports at dusk. The street lamp was still flickering, still buzzing faintly. This time, He carried something in his coat pocket, not Denise's shoe, but a letter, a draft written in her handwriting, found beneath her mattress earlier in the day when a second search was conducted. It wasn't finished, just a few lines. You said it wouldn't go this far, that you'd let me be, but I can't live like this. Every time I hear footsteps, I feel sick. You said no one would believe me if I spoke. Maybe they won't, but I have to go. Claude, please, don't come after me. There was no date, no signature, but her name was on the stationery header, printed faintly in the corner, and her tone was unmistakable. He knocked on Renon's door again. The man opened, slower this time. "I have a letter," Maigret said without raising his voice. "From Denise." Renan stiffened. "She left one. She didn't leave. But she wrote. Enough. I didn't hurt her. I didn't say you did." Renon's hands trembled. "I don't know where she is," he muttered. "You told her not to talk. You frightened her. I never touched her. I loved her." The word rang too loud in the hallway. Maigret didn't reply. He watched as the man sank down onto a chair just inside his door, burying his face in his hands. "I only wanted her to stay. Just stay." Maigret stood silent. He didn't arrest him. Not yet. He left the door open behind him. Later that night, Lucas reported that a young woman matching Denise's description had been spotted at a boarding house near Montreal, checked in under a false name. No baggage, no forward address. Safe. But gone. Maigret didn't visit her. Instead, he walked once more beneath the street lamp, its glow sputtering, faint, uncertain. The crime, if it could be called that, had no name, but the silence it left behind, in the stairwell, in the apartment, in the way Renon's door remained ajar, was louder than any scream. It was a quiet kind of resolution, the sort that made no headlines, drew no attention, and left no paperwork heavy enough to justify a file folder in the records room. No arrest, no body, no trial, just a woman who had fled, a man unraveling behind his door, and a building that went on living as if nothing had passed through its walls. Maigret didn't rush to fill in the gaps. That wasn't his way. He had learned over time that when a story ends this quietly, it's not because nothing happened. It's because no one wants to say it out loud. The next morning, he didn't go to the station. Instead, he took a tram to Montreal, wearing a scarf his wife had whereupon, and a coat slightly too warm for the weather. The boarding house was an ordinary one, to floors, green shutters, a hand-painted sign with flaking letters that read Maison Direct, rooms weekly and monthly. A faint smell of starch and damp curtains hung in the narrow corridor as he entered. He didn't give a name. He simply asked to speak with Mademoiselle Denise Blanquet. The woman at the desk, grey hair, glasses, fingers stained with ink, gave a tired nod and pointed to the stairs. "She's in room 6, top of the stairs, second door, paid for the week in advance." He didn't knock immediately. He paused outside the door, listening. No voices, no movement. After a moment, he knocked once, soft, but not uncertain. Denise opened the door slowly. Her hair was tied back loosely, and her eyes were swollen from sleep or tears, or both. She didn't flinch when she saw him, but she didn't smile either. I thought someone would come. She said. Maigret simply nodded. I didn't leave a note, she added. You left. Everything else. He said. She moved aside to let him in. The room was sparse, a suitcase half-zipped on the bed, a coat over the chair, a book lying open on a table with the spine cracked to far. She hadn't unpacked. She hadn't decided if she would stay. You were right to leave, Maigret said, taking the only other seat in the room. She looked out the window at nothing. He wouldn't let it go. At first, I thought he was kind, quiet, clever. We had long talks about books, poetry. I was lonely. He listened. That was all I needed. Then, Maigret said nothing, but it changed. He wanted to know where I went, who I spoke to. He started appearing at places I hadn't told him about. The bus stop, the grocer. I once saw him across the canal at a cafe where I never expected him, just sitting, not watching, just being visible. She gripped the edge of the table. When I tried to pull away, he said I was ungrateful, that I didn't understand what he'd given me. He started leaving notes, at first outside my door, then inside. I don't even know how he got in. You didn't report it. No one would have listened. He hadn't hit me, hadn't broken in. Just a man with a quiet voice and too much time. Maigret understood. He saw it often. Cases that weren't. Cases. People who hadn't done anything. Not anything that could be written up. Just slow violations of space, of peace, of self. She wiped her face. I just wanted to disappear before something happened that couldn't be undone. You wrote the letter. I needed to say something. In case I was wrong. In case I came back. But I didn't think anyone would find it. He stood slowly. You don't have to return. Not to that building. Not to him. I won't, she said. But I don't want to press charges. I just want him to be left alone. Let him sit in that flat forever. Maigret nodded. He didn't ask for a signature or a statement. He didn't need one. Back at the station, he wrote a simple note. Subject located. No further action requested. He placed it in the file. The file stayed thin. Later that afternoon, he returned to Rue des Deux Ports. Not because he had to, but because cases like this didn't leave him easily. He often needed to see the space again, after, to feel what had changed. Renan's window was closed, curtains drawn, no light, no silhouette. Maigret stood beneath the flickering street lamp for a long moment, listening to the hum. The building didn't know what it had been part of. It simply absorbed things, voices, secrets, fear. Like most buildings in Paris, it held the memory of things never spoken aloud. Piquemont was outside again, folding his newspaper with delicate fingers. She's safe? He asked. Yes. And him? Maigret didn't answer. He didn't have to. I suppose that's it, then, Piquemont said. Maigret glanced up at the window one last time. Sometimes it's enough. He turned and walked back down the street, boots tapping softly against the damp pavement. In the coming days, there would be no follow-up, no inquiry, no conclusions. Renan would stay in his flat, perhaps growing thinner, colder, waiting for letters that never came. Denise would find work somewhere else, possibly using a different name. The past would follow her, but quieter, and Maigret would move on to the next case, as he always did. But that lamp would continue to flicker, and every now and then a passerby would pause beneath it, feeling, without knowing why, that something had happened here, something that had almost been lost. The rhythm of Paris doesn't stop for the unresolved. It simply smooths over things with routine, as though nothing had ever happened. By the following week, Rue des Deux Ports had folded the events into its fabric. The baker resumed his banter with early customers. The concierge returned to polishing brass, and the street lamp, still unrepaired, continued to flicker like an unreliable witness. Always present, never speaking, Maigret found himself walking through that street again, not by duty, but by instinct. It was 3 days after his visit to the boarding house. A cold breeze tugged gently at his coat as he strolled past familiar doors. He hadn't spoken about Denise's case since closing. The file, the silence was part of it. These weren't cases one explained to others. There was too little to hold up, too little to prove. But something about it remained with him, like a lingering taste after a half-forgotten meal. He passed the lamppost and paused, looking up at Renon's window. The curtains were drawn again, but the light was on, a soft, low yellow glow. Someone was home. A movement on the second floor caught his attention. A silhouette briefly shifting past the curtain. It was a small movement, a man pacing, or simply walking from one room to another. But something about it seemed out of step, less composed than before, as if Renan was unraveling, not dramatically, but quietly, patiently, in a slow, private decline. Maigret considered leaving it at that. But he turned back and rang the bell at the building entrance. Inside, the air was warm but stagnant. The wood floors creaked in the same old way. Madame Vauquelin's radio played faintly above, some classical string piece drifting down the stairwell. He knocked at Renon's door. No answer. Then he knocked again. Louder this time. At last, the door opened. Barely. Renan stood in a robe, unshaven, eyes heavy. The confident, sharp features Maigret remembered were softened now, worn down like a once polished doorknob rubbed. Over time, he did not speak. He merely looked at Maigret with that blend of caution and fatigue. "I'm not here officially," Maigret said. "Just passing by." Renan didn't reply, but after a moment, he stepped back, allowing Maigret in. The flat was unchanged, neat, quiet, sparsely decorated, but the metronome on the cabinet had stopped ticking, and a tray of untouched food sat. On a side table, a half-filled teacup, a piece of bread gone dry. Renan moved to a chair and sat, not as a host would, but as a man who had nothing left to conceal and no reason to pretend. "You saw her?" he asked finally. "Yes, she's all right. She asked not to be contacted." Renan gave a single nod. "That's fair." A silence settled between them. Maigret did not fill it. After a moment, Renan spoke again, more slowly. "She was the first person I'd spoken to, really spoken to, in years. after I left teaching. People stopped calling. Colleagues drifted. Students forgot. It was as if I'd never existed. But she didn't know me from before. She listened. Maigret didn't respond. He simply watched the man as he confessed, not to a crime, but to a hollowing. I never hurt her. I know how that sounds, but I didn't. I didn't touch her. I didn't raise my voice. You frightened her, Maigret said quietly. Rena looked up, eyes tired. I wanted her to need me. That was my mistake. I confused affection with ownership, and when she tried to leave, I made it harder than it should have been. I see that now. Maigret nodded once. You won't try to see her again? No. Renan leaned back. She's already gone. Even if I knocked on every door in Paris, she wouldn't come back, and I wouldn't know what to say. He looked around the room, as if seeing it properly for the first time in days. Do you know what it's like to be someone whose absence no one notices? Maigret didn't answer, but he knew. After a few minutes, he stood. If anything changes, let us know. Renan didn't rise. Nothing will. As Maigret left, he took the stairs slower than usual. Outside, the air had warmed slightly, and the street lamp was glowing steady for once. No flicker, no hum. Just a pool of pale yellow on the pavement dot down the street. Peekmore waved from his window, but didn't come down. Even he seemed to sense the quiet return of things at Quai or favors. The work went on. A robbery in Montmartre, a stabbing near Gare de Lyon, cases with blood, evidence, and deadlines. Maigret returned to them as needed, wrote his reports, listened to testimonies. But every so often, his thoughts would drift, not to Denise, not to Renan, but to the small, undetectable pivot in a life that sends someone down a different path. A wrong sentence, an unspoken need, a glance that lingers too long. These were the things that created the cases that never quite felt like cases. He visited the cafe near Rue des Deux Ports again one evening. The same chair, the same wine, the same window view of the flickering lamp. Though it now glowed, solid and dull, the repairman must have finally replaced the bulb. A couple sat 2 tables away. Speaking in low voices, a dog barked in the distance. Life resumed, as always, and yet, in that same ordinary street, something had changed. There was no line in the report for that for 3 weeks. Maigret let it rest. Other matters took precedence. A burglary ring broken in the 11th arrondissement. A fire at a boarding house near Saint-Lazare with suspicions of arson. And a theft from an antiques dealer who insisted on describing every missing item as priceless. While Maigret gently but firmly reminded him that insurance would cover what sentiment could not. And yet, as the days passed, the memory of Rue des Deux Ports persisted like a faint itch. Not because the case was unresolved. It wasn't, not in the traditional sense. Denise was alive. Renan had withered into himself. No law had been broken that could be proven, and no official complaints had been made. But something remained. Not a question exactly, but a kind of quiet imbalance. Like a painting slightly crooked on the wall. You could ignore it, but not forget it. It was late afternoon when Margaret returned to the building again, unannounced and without purpose. The weather had turned, and a low fog pressed along the riverbanks and into the side streets, dulling their world to half-tones. The lamps had already begun to glow, though the sun had not yet fully set. The one on Rue des Deux Ports shone steadily now, fixed, obedient, giving off a light that was strangely less interesting in its reliability. The concierge didn't look up from her paper as he entered. She had long grown used to his presence. He made his way upstairs, pausing first at Denise's door. It was still locked. A light film of dust had gathered on the handle, barely visible unless you were looking for it. No one had moved in. No one had opened it. The apartment had been left as it was, intact, untouched, as though waiting. On the second floor, he knocked once at Renon's. No answer. He waited a moment, then tried again. Still nothing. Just as he was about to turn away, he heard a faint scraping from inside. Not movement, exactly, but the low rustle of life. He knocked a third time. Eventually, the door opened an inch. Renan looked thinner. His hair hadn't been trimmed, and his sweater hung from his frame as if it no longer recognized the man it was meant to clothe. Behind him, the room was darker than usual, the curtains half drawn, the walls dim. A stack of unopened letters sat on the table. The metronome remained still. "Inspector," he said, not warmly, not coldly. "I was in the area." Renan let him in without a word. Margaret stepped into the quiet. The flat had changed in a way that wasn't immediately visible. The air felt different, mustier, but also heavier, as though someone had stopped opening windows. The light bulbs glowed yellow and weak. The books on the shelves were all in place, but a layer of dust coated their tops, like a season had passed. Without touch, "I haven't seen anyone in days," Renan said, sitting slowly. "You're not well?" "I'm not sick, just disconnected." He looked down at his hands. "It's as though I fell off the world and no one noticed." Margaret said nothing. He looked around again, not for evidence, not for proof, but for feeling. For what wasn't said. "Do you ever think," Renan began after a pause, "that a person can commit harm without meaning to, not from cruelty, not even from obsession, but simply by wanting something too much?" Margaret's pipe remained in his coat pocket. He didn't light it. He merely nodded. "She made me feel seen," Renan went on, "and I tried to hold onto that feeling. Not her, the feeling. But it's the same thing, isn't it?" She was frightened. Margaret said softly, "I know." A silence followed, a longer one. In it, Margaret heard the ticking of something, deeper than a clock, the slow accumulation of remorse, not loud, not dramatic, but real. "Have you considered leaving this place?" Margaret asked. Renan looked up, startled. "Where would I go? Anywhere." Renan managed a faint smile. "People like me don't start over. We just fade." Margaret stood. "Fading isn't required." He didn't press. He didn't suggest therapy or redemption or confessions. That wasn't his role, and he had no illusions about saving people. He only wanted Renan to know that the door, metaphorically or not, wasn't locked from the outside. At the threshold, Renan spoke again. "Do you think she'll come back?" "No." Renan nodded. "Good." Maigret descended the stairs slowly, stopping once to glance at the empty mailbox marked D. Blanket. The paper inside had curled at the corners, untouched. Time had passed there to dot outside. The air smelled of damp stone and cooling concrete. Evening was arriving without hurry. He returned to the cafe, ordered a black coffee, and sat at his usual corner. The waiter had come to recognize him, but didn't ask questions. Across the street lamp cast its glow faithfully on the wet pavement, revealing nothing. From time to time, Maigret had cases like this. Not tragedies in the usual sense, but quiet rearrangements of lives, where no crime could be charged, no trial could be held, and yet something deeply human had fractured. These cases didn't go into ledgers, but they stayed with him longer than most. He finished his coffee and left a few coins on the table. Outside, the cold had deepened, and people passed in twos and threes, hurrying home. He looked up one last time at the window on the second floor. The light had gone out. Perhaps he would not come back again. Perhaps he didn't need to. But he knew that every time he passed a narrow street with a flickering lamp, he would remember this one, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was not. The days lengthened slowly as winter began to lose its grip on the city, though the wind still pressed cold fingers against the collars of coats. On Quai des Orfèvres, things moved on, the usual cycle of petty thefts, domestic disputes, and bureaucratic quarrels that filled Maigret's calendar. He sat through 2 meetings about departmental funding, approved a transfer for a young inspector with potential, and responded to 3 letters from the public, one sincere, 2 absurd. Still, now and then, his mind drifted back to Rue des Deux Ports. It wasn't that anything new had happened. There had been no report, no incident, no tip from the local station. Denise had vanished from the narrative, exactly as she'd wished, and Claude Renan had receded with equal quiet. And yet, in Maigret's thoughts, the street remained as fixed as the lamp itself. One morning, Lucas entered his office carrying a thin file. A woman from the 13th arrondissement dropped this off, he said she didn't want to file a complaint, just thought we might want to look at it. Maigret opened the folder. Inside was a brief handwritten note. "This is not a formal accusation. I'm not sure it means anything, but I used to live at Rue des Deux Ports, on the 2nd floor, before the man there now. He left me notes. Nothing threatening, but I didn't feel safe. It was signed only with initials, CP. Beneath the letter was a folded envelope. Inside were 3 small slips of paper, all written in the same hand. Each said something vague, almost innocent. "You looked very thoughtful today. You shouldn't be so sad when you read. I hope the stairs weren't too cold this morning." None of it qualified as harassment, exactly. But the tone had a certain possessiveness, a watchfulness that echoed Denise's story too closely to ignore. Maigret set the note down and leaned back in his chair. He closed his eyes for a moment. The room was silent except for the soft scratch of Lucas shuffling a few folders nearby. "Where's Renan now?" Maigret asked without opening his eyes. Lucas hesitated. As far as I know, still in that flat. Any reports from the neighbors? Nothing official. Maigret opened his eyes and nodded slowly. Let's go. Rue des Deux Ports looked unchanged. It always did. But this time, something was waiting beneath the stillness. Maigret could feel it before he even entered the building. It was in the air, the way people glanced at the windows, the way the concierge didn't greet him when he passed. The hallway was dim, the bulbs overhead yellowed, and one of them flickering again. A replacement due, or perhaps just neglect. On the second floor, the door to Renon's flat was shut, but Maigret noticed a faint scratch near the handle. Nothing dramatic, just a mark, like someone had fumbled with the key in a hurry, or tried to lock it from outside. He knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, more firmly. Still no response. Lucas stepped back and looked to Maigret for the word. It came with a nod. The concierge brought the spare key reluctantly. I haven't seen him in 3 days, she said. But the rent's paid. I figured he was away. Maigret took the key. The door opened without resistance. The smell hit them first. Not decay, not yet, but staleness. Closed air, a flat that hadn't been lived in or properly opened for days. The curtains were fully drawn. The air was heavy, the furniture undisturbed. And then they found him. Claude Renan was in the armchair, fully dressed, hands resting on the arms, his head tilted back, eyes closed. On the table beside him, a glass with a cloudy liquid and a bottle, uncorked, a suicide, Maigret thought. Even before they checked the body, but not the violent kind, not even the desperate kind, just a surrender, quiet, like someone who'd been waiting for permission to disappear. Maigret didn't speak for a long moment. Lucas looked uneasy, shifting his weight. Do we call it in? Yes. Maigret walked through the flat slowly. There was no note. But there didn't need to be. The note had been written already, in the way Renan had stopped answering the door, in the dust on the books, in the forgotten metronome, in the way Denise had looked when she opened the door in Montreal, resigned, gentle. Finished. Later, when the medics came and removed the body, the neighbors gathered silently in the stairwell. No one asked questions. No one expressed shock. One woman crossed herself. Madame Vauquelin watched from her doorway and whispered. He always looked like he was waiting for someone to forgive him. Maigret stayed until the flat was empty. Then he closed the door behind him. Outside, the lamp was flickering again. That evening, Maigret sat at home in his armchair, pipe unlit, newspaper folded on his lap. Madame Maigret brought him coffee and said nothing when he didn't touch it. Do you remember the man I mentioned, from the street with the flickering lamp? He asked after a while. She nodded, sewing needle in hand. He's dead now. She didn't reply, but she stopped sewing. There was no case, Maigret said. Not really. No crime, just quiet damage. He let the words settle. He didn't belong anywhere. And the one person who made him feel seen, he tried to own her instead of just being grateful. Madame Maigret looked at him. Some people don't know how to be alone, or how to stop being lonely. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, The rain had started again, brushing softly against the glass. A bus hissed past, and someone hurried down the street with a newspaper over their head. "You know," Margaret said, "we chase the wrong things sometimes. Proof, motive, justice. But sometimes the truth is just a feeling, and when you find it, there's nothing left to arrest." She set down her sewing and joined him at the window. "Did he hurt her?" she asked. Double quotes, "Yes," Margaret said, "but not with hands." And together they stood watching the rain fall on a city that would forget this story before the morning. The week that followed was full of sun, unusual for March, yet unmistakable. Light breaking through the grey, warming the bridges of Paris, softening the edges of the old buildings that lined the narrow streets. In Margaret's office, the windows remained shut, despite Lucas's subtle attempts to open one. It wasn't that Margaret disliked the air. He simply preferred it filtered, quiet, still. The report on Claude Renan had been finalized and filed. Cause of death: ingestion of a toxic compound in sufficient quantity to induce cardiac arrest. No foul play suspected. No surviving family contacted. The investigation was closed within 48 hours. There had been no funeral, not even a public posting. The man had left life the way he lived it, unnoticed by most, misunderstood by the rest. For Margaret, the matter didn't feel closed. Not because he doubted the outcome, he didn't, but because something about Renan's slow disappearance still clung to the corners of his thoughts. Not regret, exactly, not even pity, just a nagging, human disquiet that couldn't be categorized or summarized in any report. On a quiet Thursday morning, with no pressing cases and an hour to spare, he left the office and walked. No destination, no particular aim, just the city under his shoes, familiar and alive. His feet carried him, inevitably, toward Montreal. The boarding house still stood, humble and square, the curtains drawn in half the windows, the same painted. Sign hung at an angle. He didn't hesitate. He stepped through the door and greeted the landlady with a nod. "I'm looking for Denise Blanket." The woman pursed her lips. "She's still here, quiet as ever. Pays on time. May I see her?" "I'll ask." She disappeared up the stairs and returned a minute later. "She'll see you." Margaret climbed slowly, counting the steps as he went. When he reached room 6, the door was already ajar. Denise stood inside, her back straight, her expression unreadable. She had changed, not in appearance, but in manner. Less tired, more settled. The lines around her mouth had softened, and her eyes no longer looked past people. "Thank you for coming," she said. Margaret stepped in and closed the door gently behind him. She gestured to the chair, took her own seat near the window. A pot of coffee sat on a tray between them, still warm. "I heard," she said, "not from anyone, just, I knew. He died quietly," Margaret replied. "He left no note." Denise nodded. She didn't cry. "He wanted to be seen, and when he wasn't, he stopped existing." Margaret lit his pipe. The smoke drifted lazily toward the ceiling. "I've wondered," she said after a pause, "if I should have stayed, not for him, but to end it differently, so it didn't have to come to that. Maigret shook his head. You left. That was the ending. But endings feel like choices, and this, it still feels like an escape. He studied her face, calm now, but shadowed by thought. You were not responsible for him, Maigret said gently. What he did alone. What he needed, no one person could give. She looked down at her hands. I thought he was harmless. So did I. A quiet filled the room. Outside, a bird called somewhere in the distance. The clatter of dishes echoed faintly from below. Paris moved on. Will there be anything? She asked. A trial? Or? No. He didn't leave behind questions, just silence. Denise poured herself a small cup of coffee and didn't drink it. She stared into it like it might give an answer. I don't know if I'll stay here much longer, she said. Maigret raised an eyebrow. This place Munchel feels like a waiting room. I've been catching my breath. But I don't want to live on the edge of something forever. I want somewhere that doesn't remind me of being afraid. He understood. More than she knew. Do you know where you'll go? She shook her head. But somewhere else. I'll find work. I'm good at what I do. Even if no one notices. Someone noticed, Maigret said. She smiled faintly. Yes, but not in the right way. He tapped the bowl of his pipe gently against the tray, careful not to disturb the stillness between them. You were kind to come, she said, quietly. I came for myself. She tilted her head, questioning. There's something about unfinished endings that don't sit well. He explained. Even when they're tidy on paper. Denise stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain slightly aside. Sunlight streamed across her face. Do you think it matters? She asked. The way things end, sometimes, Maigret said. Sometimes it's the only thing people remember. She let the curtain fall. I hope, she said. One day I won't think about him at all. You will, Maigret replied. But it won't hurt. She looked at him. Does it ever stop following you? These people, these stories? Maigret didn't answer right away. Then he said, not really. But you learn to live beside them, like neighbors. You nod when you pass them in your thoughts. And then you keep walking. She laughed, softly. That sounds like a Maigret answer. He stood. It is. At the door. He paused. If you need anything. I won't, she said. But thank you. He stepped out into the hallway, the door closing behind him with a gentle click. Outside. The day had warmed. And people walked, without coats. Children shouted to one another across the street. And a woman balanced a basket of fresh bread against her hip. Life didn't pause for past griefs. It only absorbed them. Maigret walked slowly back to the metro, hands in his pockets, hat pulled low. There was nothing left to investigate. And yet, the case stayed with him, not because of what it had revealed, but because of what it hadn't. A man no one missed. A woman who nearly disappeared. A building that had seen both, and a flickering lamp that lit them not as suspects, but as people, ordinary, lonely, and complicated. At the station entrance. He paused once more, and looked behind him. No one followed. he descended the stairs. Into the tunnels of the city. A few weeks passed. Spring crept into the city with cautious steps. No great fanfare, just the scent of new leaves in the morning air, the sudden warmth on stone benches, and the return of laughter through open windows. At Quai d'Orfèvres, the files on Maigret's desk grew and thinned in uneven rhythm. A stabbing near Belleville, a suspected forgery in the 16th, a missing baker who turned out to have simply gone to visit his sister in Tours. Without telling anyone, the world, it seemed, was always full of explanations. One afternoon, Maigret sat in his office with the door cracked open, the sunlight catching the dust that hovered in stillness near the window. He held in his hands a letter, short, neat, without extravagance. The envelope had been forwarded from Montreal. Inspector, I wanted to let you know I've found a new position. A small office in Nantes, nothing special, but the people are kind. I'm renting a room above a florist. The mornings smell like lilies, which still surprises me. I'm trying to forget Paris, but I think I'll carry part of it with me forever. Rue des Deux Ports, and the way you looked at me, like I hadn't done something wrong just for being frightened. I hope you're well. D.B. Maigret folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. He didn't show it to Lucas or mention it to anyone. There was nothing in it that changed the outcome, but something in it mattered all the same. He placed the envelope inside a drawer, not the case drawer, but the one where he kept things unrelated to the job. A postcard from his niece, a thank you note from a grocer he'd once helped after a break-in, a pressed leaf his wife had once found between pages of a library book and handed to him. As if it were a gift. They weren't evidence, and they weren't official, but they stayed. Later that evening, he left the office without finishing his reports. The sun was still up as he stepped into the street, and the city felt slower than usual, as if it too were between pages of something. He walked without hurry, following familiar streets that turned without reason. By the time he reached Rue des Deux Ports, the light had begun to fade, and the street lamp had come alive again, a clean, steady glow now, no longer flickering. It had been repaired properly. Finally, the sidewalk beneath it was dry, despite the damp earlier in the day. He stood there a while, looking up at the building. The third-floor window was still empty, the curtains drawn. Dust had begun to settle on the panes. No one had taken the flat. Not yet. The second-floor window, Renan's old apartment, showed faint movement. The hint of new life. A tenant, perhaps. Someone unaware of the story that lingered in the walls. Someone who had moved in with no memory of the man who had once sat for hours behind those curtains, watching the street below. Maigret didn't go in. He had no reason to, but he stood for a moment longer, pipe in hand, unlit, letting the glow of the street lamp settle on his shoulders. This case, if it could be called that, had ended not with an arrest or confession, but with a disappearance, a letter, and a quiet death that drew no public interest. Yet it had left a deeper mark than most. He thought about the kind of harm that leaves no bruises, the kind no law is written for. He thought about Denise, and the way she had once looked over her shoulder even in her own home. He thought about Renan, and how a man could slowly collapse inward until the weight of his own silence became too much to bear. Margaret had always believed that justice wasn't only about answers. Sometimes it was about seeing, truly seeing, the people involved, even when they didn't ask to be seen, even when they tried to vanish in the middle of the story. He crossed the street, entered the small cafe where he had once waited for Piquemont, and took his old table in the corner. The same waiter approached, older now, his hair grayer, but still attentive. "White wine, monsieur." Margaret nodded. Outside. The lamp illuminated the sidewalk in a quiet pool of light. People passed through it without noticing. But Margaret noticed. He always had. Light, after all, was not about brightness. It was about what it revealed and what it left in shadow. His wine arrived. He sipped slowly, letting the warmth of the room settle around him. This was not a case he would retell, not one he'd use to instruct a young inspector or reference in his notebooks. It lacked a conclusion. It lacked the mechanics of guilt, motive, resolution. But it had shown him something else. How easily people can slip past the edge of things. How unnoticed suffering often wears the face of the polite neighbor, the quiet tenant, the man who always pays rent on time. A few minutes later, Margaret stood, left a few coins under his glass, and stepped back into the street. The night had arrived without thunder or drama, just the usual hush, just the old city breathing steadily beneath his feet. He walked toward the corner, where Rue des Deux Ports met the broader avenue, and turned once to look back. The lamp stood tall. The building behind it remained still, but something in the silence had changed. Margaret tipped his hat faintly, to no one in particular. Then he turned and walked on. A few months had passed. Spring gave way to early summer, and the air in Paris grew heavy with warmth and unfamiliar green. The bouquinists along the Seine opened their stalls wider each morning, and the streets shimmered softly beneath sun-baked stone. The city turned its attention to new things: festivals, elections, scandals, and Rue des Deux Ports. Like all quiet places in a city of noise, faded back into anonymity. But some stories don't conclude. They simply sink into the soft sediment of memory, half forgotten, half alive, waiting for a glance, a voice, a chance to return. Margaret didn't speak of the case. Not to his wife, not to Lucas, not to colleagues who occasionally teased him for his preference for cases without crimes. He had long learned that there was little to say when an ending left no answer, only silence. What would he tell them? That a woman left quietly, a man died quietly, and between the two was a shadow too soft to hold. One morning, with the station calm and the caseload unusually light, Margaret pulled out the drawer where he kept things that didn't belong elsewhere. Denise's letter was there, uncreased, carefully folded. He read it again. The words felt cooler now, not distant, just settled. She had moved on. That was all. And yet, something tugged at him. Not guilt. He didn't feel guilty. Not doubt. The facts were as clear as they'd ever be. But something. That afternoon, he visited the archives, not for a case, not for any reason that could be explained. On paper, he searched for past tenants of Rue des Deux Ports. It wasn't difficult. The city kept records, tax filings, leases, rental notices. He found the flat on the second floor had changed hands often. 5 tenants in 9 years. A woman named Claire Pugnet had lived there 3 years before Renan. Her initials matched the letter that had reached him anonymously. He requested her contact information. Retired now, living in Nantes. He made the call himself. Madame Pugnet, this is Chief Inspector Maigret. May I speak with you about a flat you once lived in? There was a pause. That place? She said softly. It's been years. I know, but I'd like to meet, if you're willing. They agreed on a cafe not far from her building. She arrived precisely on time, short, grey-haired, and self-contained. She ordered tea. When it came, she didn't drink it. I wasn't sure if I should contact the police back then, she said. It seemed so minor, and I didn't want to cause trouble. Maigret listened. He was always polite, always formal, but I felt watched. Every time I opened my door, I thought he'd be there. Sometimes he was, other times it just felt like he had been. She sipped her tea. One night, I found the door to my flat open when I came home. Just an inch. Nothing stolen. Nothing moved. But I knew I had locked it. I left the next week. You never told the landlord. I said I had a family emergency. I thought maybe I was imagining it. But I wasn't. Maigret nodded. You weren't. She looked relieved, or perhaps just confirmed. He didn't press her for more. She'd already said what mattered. Back at the office, he updated nothing. No file was reopened. There was nothing more to do. But that night, he took the metro to Rue des Deux Ports again. Walking the last few blocks in the growing dusk, the lamp was on, steady and pale. The 3rd floor remained vacant. The 2nd floor, Renan's old flat, had a new tenant, a man in his 40s who worked in insurance and who, according to the concierge, had already asked if he could repaint the walls. The building smelled of fresh plaster and detergent. Now, something was being erased. Maigret stood beneath the lamp again, as he had on the first evening, months ago now, when Picmel had pointed to the window and said, I feel something's wrong. He didn't need to go inside. He already knew what the rooms held. But as he turned to leave, a shape stepped out from the alley near the grocer. A girl, not Denise, but younger still, holding a notebook under one arm and looking up at the 3rd floor. He watched her for a moment. She hesitated, looked back down, crossed the street, disappeared around the corner. A new tenant, perhaps, or maybe someone who had once lived nearby. Returning to check an old address. The world didn't announce its continuations. It just moved forward. Maigret walked back to the cafe, ordered a brandy, and sat quietly at his corner table. As he sipped, he thought again of Denise's letter, of Renan's last expression, of Claire Punet's unspoken fear. These people, these small tragedies, didn't create headlines, but they were the city, its skin, its nerves, and the lamp, that broken, buzzing lamp that had once flickered above the doorway like a bad conscience still stood, repaired, yes, but never quite innocent. Maigret finished his brandy and left the coins on the table. He didn't look back this time. He knew the building was still there, but what lingered beneath it was no longer his to carry. It had become part of the street, and the street, as always, remembered everything, but said nothing.